I used to think birthdays were safe. Restaurants make them look that way. Candles, chocolate letters on plates, servers clapping like they're oxygen. I know this because I work in a restaurant, the kind where we call it fine, casual, and mean, don't spill the Bordeaux while you're carrying the fries. I know what a good night looks like under dim lights and a bar that hums. I know how to turn an evening into a memory. I also know how to carry a tray through a room without being seen, which turns out to be useful when your wife thanks another man in front of your family. She said his name like a secret she wanted to be caught. I owe tonight to someone very special, she said into a glass that threw gold across her cheek. Everyone leaned closer like gravity had changed. My mother paused with a fork halfway to her mouth. My sister smoothed a napkin that needed no smoothing. Our son, Max, looked up from the paper airplane he'd perfected out of a paper menu and smiled because he thought we were all about to clap for cake. And then Claire said, "Victor, you've been such a rock for me. Thank you for making this year possible." And the room rearranged itself without moving. It wasn't a toast. It was a tiny collapse disguised as gratitude. Victor raised his glass like he was the kind of man who knew where cameras were even when there weren't any. He wore the kind of watch you buy when you want to convince the world time is a pet. I felt my face do nothing, which took effort. In my head, I saw the dish pit at closing time, plates stacked high, water running, steam turning hard, mistakes soft. I told my body to be a dishwasher, handle heat without breaking. I said, "Thank you for coming, sweetheart," and kissed my wife on the temple like it hadn't just become a stage. People will tell you they knew the exact moment something broke. They're lying. Most breaks are a chorus of small sounds. For months, little noises had been singing. Late meetings with vague titles, receipts with generous tips in handwriting that didn't look like hers, a new perfume that smelled like a hotel lobby. I'm a shift manager. I notice patterns because patterns save you. A server who forgets to double-check the table number will sprint the length of the dining room with bone marrow for vegans. A manager who ignores patterns ends up comping desserts and calling it hospitality. I had been comping quiet for too long. Victor Hale had the public generosity of a man who enjoyed being thanked. He sponsored Claire's community arts project when their last donor went quiet. He sent a florist so loud our apartment smelled like a conversation. He introduced her to people who use impact as a noun and wear lanyards like they're on safari. She said he was a mentor. She said mentor the way people say sober when they want you to stop asking if they're going to drink. I didn't ask. I did what I'm good at. I watched, I counted, and I waited. I moved bills into a trust with our son's name on it because I have a habit of preparing rooms before people know they'll need to talk in them. When she thanked him at her birthday, I was already holding Plan Quiet in my pocket. Part of it was a white envelope. Max didn't know what was inside. He thought it was a card with a drawing. He had drawn a blue cake with too many candles and a stick figure family under a string of triangles that he insisted were flags. I told him this envelope was special because it was for Mom, and his job was to hand it to her when I squeezed his shoulder. I told him that his job, like mine, was to be brave and gentle at the same time. He nodded as if I'd asked him to carry the moon. You should know something about me. I am not vengeful in the way movies understand vengeance. I don't throw plates or storm out or invent speeches that explode at the right moment. I understand rooms, schedules, the kind of power that lives in timing. I am the kind of person who knows exactly when to fire the ticket for the medium rare ribeye so that it kisses the heat and finds the table at the same time as the scallops. I believe in heat management, in seasoning at the right second, in sending the thing at the temperature the table can actually eat. If revenge is heat, I wanted a low simmer that turned tough meat tender. Claire smiled wide when she thanked him. The smile looked like a photograph that had been smoothed too often. She went down the table naming people who helped. My mother for always being there, my sister for watching Max after school, me for being supportive while I chase big things. I swallowed the stone of that line and felt it settle. Victor stood and gave a micro speech about community and courage that sounded like a press release that had lost its verbs. People with money are very good at nouns. He said he believed in Claire. He said she had vision. He said we. I pushed air through my nose as if I was cooling soup. When the server brought the cake, I touched Max's shoulder. He put his paper plane down carefully, took the envelope with two hands like it might fly, and handed it to Claire. She made a show of surprise. "What's this?" she asked, and Max said, "From Dad." I smiled and shook my head. "From us." She slid a finger under the flap like a magician and pulled out the first page. Her smile tightened into concentrate. She looked at me, and then at Victor, and then at Max, like he had handed her a mirror. "What is this?" she asked again, softer, as if the question itself could undo contents. I said it was a gift. I had written the letter in a voice I know how to trust. Clean, not cruel. It said we had established a college trust for Max because his future deserved stability. It said we were moving our joint savings into that trust with me as trustee for now, to be amended upon any mediation agreement. It said I hoped her project succeeded and that if she needed me to adjust schedules to support her workload, we would talk like adults. It said I was pausing shared credit to review transactions I didn't understand. It said I loved our son more than stories about us. The last line read, "I want us to be the kind of people who tell the truth in daylight." Claire folded the letter like it might be injured by a crease. She placed it back in the envelope with the care you give to something you don't want to admit is heavy. Victor looked like a man who had just seen a wine list without prices. My mother exhaled evenly. My sister sent me a text that said simply, "Okay." Max leaned in to ask if the cake was chocolate, because children save adults from melodrama without knowing their heroes. The server cut generous slices. Claire didn't eat hers. Victor's fork touched his plate 3 times and left no bite. We didn't argue at the restaurant. That would have been a gift to the wrong gods. We took the party home, which is to say people made excuses and kissed Claire's cheek and carried flowers into the night. Max fell asleep in the car with frosting on his lip, because childhood is merciful to itself. I lifted him onto his bed and used a warm cloth because he hates waking sticky. Claire stood in the hallway with her arms folded tight enough to iron a shirt. "What was that?" she asked. I said it was a college fund and a boundary. She said boundary like it was a foreign food she hadn't ordered. We sat at the kitchen table because I wanted corners. I poured water in 2 glasses and touched neither. Claire asked if I was accusing her of something. I said I was protecting our son and our home from things that didn't like daylight. She said Victor had been helping her with donors. I said Victor had been covering drinks at 11:43 p.m. at the Shoreline Hotel on a Thursday that had been labeled mentor dinner in her calendar. I said the hotel had cameras, and accuracy is not an insult. She looked at the refrigerator where we hang school drawings and said, "I can explain." I said good, because explaining is what adults do when they want to be trusted. She explained the way a person explains when they are learning what the truth costs. Victor had floated her bills when a small grant fell apart. He had connected her to a committee that liked rooms where he liked being seen. He had a way of making her feel like the project could leap if she would just agree to be brave. I did not ask what being brave meant in those rooms. I already knew. I asked whether he was her boss. She said no, he was a donor. I said that donors with expectations have a job title. They just don't like to say it out loud. The second envelope was in my bag by the door. I told Claire that after we slept, after we took Max to school, we would sit down again and talk about everything with a neutral person. I told her I had contacted a mediator because I am done outsourcing courage to mood. She said I was blowing things up. I said I was doing the opposite. I was narrowing the blast radius. She said it was her birthday. I said birthdays reveal the year you built. She cried quiet, the kind of crying that sounds like a faucet 2 rooms away. I did not touch her because there are kinds of touch that can be rented, and I didn't want to be mistaken for one of those. I slept on the couch because it felt honest. Morning came without music. Max woke with his hair doing what hair does when joy had been interrupted but not removed. It reached out in all directions and forgave everyone. I made pancakes and cut bananas like coins. We took him to school where a teacher with a scarf like a small sunset said, "Happy birthday to Mom." Max said, "It was chocolate," which is the kind of summary the world needs more of. Claire and I stood in the parking lot afterward watching parents pretend mornings are easy. "What's in the other envelope?" she asked. I told her it was a grown-up gift for after office hours. The mediator's office smelled like the kind of tea adults tell you you'll learn to like. The woman who greeted us wrote our names on a folded card, even though we know our names, which is a kind of ritual I respect. She asked for our goals in 1 sentence each. Claire said, "I don't want to be punished for ambition." I said, "I want our son to know stability and honesty." The mediator nodded like those sentences could be neighbors. She asked us to describe our finances without performance. Claire looked at me as if money had become a person. I handed over statements, a spreadsheet that bored even me, and a copy of the trust document. The mediator said, "This is thorough." She meant, I can work with this. I didn't say anything about Victor until I had to. When I did it with nouns, expenses, dates, times. An image printed from a volunteer's social media album where Claire smiles 3 feet from him in a hotel lobby she told me was a conference room. Shoes and light are louder than captions. The mediator asked if there was a power dynamic we needed to name. I said donor and beneficiary. Claire said friend and friend. The mediator wrote both. Then she asked if we were safe at home. We said yes at the same time, and it sounded true. Safety is sometimes a small data point. It still matters. The second envelope came out in our living room when dusk tried to make everything look softer. Claire sat on the edge of the couch like a swimmer at the lip of a pool, toes in, not ready. I placed the envelope on the coffee table like a polite wait. She didn't reach for it, so I spoke first. I told her the envelope contained a temporary separation plan and a draft co-parenting schedule we could adjust. I told her it also contained a conflict of interest disclosure letter addressed to the board of her project and a version addressed to Victor's company's HR, sealed and ready to be used only if necessary. I told her I didn't want to set anyone on fire. I wanted to let light do what it's always done for people who stop hiding. She picked up the envelope like it might bite. She read the first page. She looked at me like the room had narrowed to a hallway that led to a truth. "You would do this?" she asked. I told her I had already done a lot less than I wanted and a lot more than would make a good story. I told her that when you run a restaurant, you learn the difference between heat that cooks and heat that burns. I told her I was done burning. She read the next page and then the next, and then sat very still. In the stillness, I remembered our first apartment where the sink coughed and the neighbors laughed like the world was theirs to break. I remembered the day Max was born, and the nurse who handed him to me like a responsibility and a wonder. And I remembered promising both of us that I would be the person who didn't flinch when honesty showed up. Claire asked what I wanted from her. It should have been a simple question. I wanted clarity, I said. I wanted her to put into the air what she had put into rooms where I wasn't invited. I wanted her to choose being his mother over being a myth someone was selling her about herself. I wanted her to admit that men who appear at midnight with solutions are rarely mentors. I wanted her to be able to look at Max in 10 years and tell him the story without skipping chapters. She said she couldn't say all of that tonight. I said, then say a piece, and we'll return to the table tomorrow. We were polite the way people are when they are very close to not being. In the days that followed, our home learned a new sound. Silence that wasn't punishment. We spoke to a counselor who didn't pretend to be a judge. He asked good questions like, what do you protect when you say nothing? And what does gratitude cost when it's misdirected? He looked at me and said, managers are often the last to know the house is on fire, because they're the first to grab a hose. He looked at Claire and said, ambition is a beautiful engine and a brutal driver. We left sessions with homework that wasn't insulting. Write down 3 times someone told you the truth this week, even if you didn't like it. We did the homework like people who had discovered there are worse chores. I kept working. The restaurant didn't care about my marriage, and that was a relief. People still wanted oysters brined in something they couldn't pronounce and fries sprinkled with herbs that tasted like the memory of a garden. Servers still asked me to comp drinks when a table celebrated surviving life. I still walked the floor counting beats per minute in laughter. On Friday, Victor came in. Of course he did. Money likes the kind of room where it might be recognized. He sat at table 9 with a woman who looked like she understood the difference between expensive and priced. He didn't see me because people rarely see the man who can hear the kitchen ticket printer in his sleep. I sent a manager to the table with a bright smile that could block a camera flash. The manager explained that another party had requested privacy and we were seating accordingly. Victor's eyes slid over me, then back to his date. He ordered something off menu. I said we were fresh out. He smiled the way people smile when they forget rooms have histories. I took my break in the alley behind the restaurant where the dumpsters smell like work and the air feels like a truce. I thought about choices and about how some men don't understand that they're not required. Claire had her own choices. She told me she had asked Victor to step back from the project. He said he couldn't. It would look bad. She said she would disclose the relationship to her board. He told her honesty would tank donations because donors pass judgment with their wallets. She told him our son had handed her a letter. He laughed and said that was manipulative. That night she told me she had cried in a bathroom stall because crying into plush towels is for people who want to be rescued, and she had decided she didn't. The next morning she asked for the COI letter. I handed her a pen and did not say anything she could read as gloating. Sometimes the closest thing to victory is not performing the part. The board met in a room with too much sunlight for deceit. Claire read her statement quickly, like a swimmer trusting momentum. She did not mention hotel lobbies or receipts. She did not need to. She talked about boundaries and ambition and how gratitude can be a mask if you're not careful. A woman with silver hair who had watched the city fundraisers evolve over 30 years nodded like she had been waiting for this sentence since the 90s. The board chair said they would convene an ethics review and thanked Claire for her honesty. The word thank slipped and found its rightful owner. Victor's reaction didn't arrive in person. It arrived as an email with a tone only money can afford. His company's HR informed Claire that Victor had recused himself from any further involvement with her project, and that they took conflict seriously. The letter was 6 paragraphs of nothing that nonetheless changed the air. In a separate email to me, A lawyer wrote that any suggestion of impropriety was unsubstantiated and unhelpful. I wrote back 2 words. Understood, counselor. Then I printed the email and slid it into a folder labeled Proof the World is Predictable, and went back to teaching a new host how to read a room from the doorway. Max was the only one who refused to be complicated. He wanted Pokemon cards and a better soccer ball. He wanted us to pick him up on time and not talk over him when he found a joke that he didn't yet understand, but believed would be important to adults. He wanted pancakes on Saturday, and for us to clap when he learned to tie his laces in a way that would survive a playground. He didn't want to hear any new names at bedtime, which is how children tell you to stop adding characters to a story. We did what he asked except for the clapping, which we overdid because our hands needed something to be good at. I wish I could tell you that everything got clean quickly. It didn't. The first week after the board meeting, Claire was fragile in the way a bridge is fragile when it's holding more than it should. She apologized 6 times in one day for crimes she hadn't committed, dropping a cup, misplacing her keys, leaving a light on. Apology is a reflex long after guilt leaves the room. The second week, she got angry about cereal. I listened and realized it wasn't about cereal and asked if she wanted to take a walk or take a breath. She said both, and we did. The third week, she stopped wearing the perfume that smelled like a lobby. I noticed and didn't say anything, because praise at the wrong time is a leash. The third envelope did not come to our house. It went to an attorney who spoke crisp and carried a yellow pad like it was part of her spine. The letter to HR, with attachments, took the long route. Through a compliance inbox, then to a person who understood that optics are just ethics with makeup. We didn't hear anything for days, which is how you know a system is either working or sleeping. Then a polite notification. Victor would be on an extended leave to pursue personal projects. I imagined those projects were mostly mirrors. The city does its gossip, and the restaurant hears a version of all of it at the bar. People said it was a misunderstanding. People said it was a hit job. People said nothing because they preferred their food warm. I wiped a counter that didn't need wiping and let the room be itself. Claire asked if we could talk about the separation plan. We sat again at the kitchen table, and the corners were still there. We agreed on schedules for Max that respected school and soccer and the dignity of being 8. We agreed on money like adults agree when they are tired of being children. We signed our names to lines that looked like roads. Claire asked if this meant we were done. I said it meant we were honest. She said she felt smaller than last month, but truer. I said truth does that before it stretches you back out. She laughed a small laugh that had space in it, and then cried in a way that sounded like relief was a river learning rest. At work, I found that teaching kept me upright. I trained a new server named Mia, who had hands steady as prayer and eyes that saw the table before the table knew it needed water. I told her that our job is to notice without being noticed, to deliver heat at the exact moment someone realizes they're hungry. She asked me if I liked working nights. I said I liked being useful when people thought all they wanted was a meal. She asked me if I liked birthdays. I said, it depends who's thanking whom. At home, routines grew like plants that had finally figured out the window. We put a whiteboard on the fridge with 5 boxes: school, work, Max, money, honesty. We checked boxes with ugly markers and didn't pretend it was pretty. Claire moved some clothes out of the closet and into a bag that she left near the door for 3 days, like a test. Then she moved it to her car. We did not make a speech about it. We told Max that sometimes love looks like 2 houses that share a calendar. He asked if that meant he would get 2 sets of pancakes. I said we would see, which is father for yes, with scheduling. On a Sunday, I took Max to the market, and we bought bread that had a name nobody could pronounce without smiling. We ran into Claire coming from a meeting with the new, less excited board. She looked lighter, which has nothing to do with weight. She walked with us past the flower stall and the man who sells records that smell like other people's basements. Max put his small hand in both of ours and laughed like he had invented a bridge. We did not argue. We did not plan. We were simply there. It was a quiet victory I did not put in a folder. I kept it where it belonged, somewhere in the body. The texts from Victor changed tone when he realized quiet was permanent. He sent one that said he hoped we could be adults. I didn't respond because we already were. He sent one that said Claire had overreacted. I saved it in case anyone ever wanted to measure his distance from decency. He sent one that said he would always be grateful for what we had built together. I printed that because I enjoy evidence that does my job for me. Claire forwarded the messages to the board without commentary. You don't need adjectives when the nouns are doing push-ups. The counselor asked us what we wanted our son to say about this year in 10 years. I said I wanted him to say my parents disagreed and kept me safe. Claire said she wanted him to say, I learned the difference between help and a hook. The counselor smiled like a person who likes her job. He said we were telling the truth in language a child could understand, which is rarer than it should be. He asked if we wanted to reconcile. I said I didn't know. Claire said she didn't either. He said that not knowing is an honest room if you ventilate it. The restaurant ran a private event one night, a fundraiser for something that mattered and something that didn't, the way these things usually go. The speaker spoke about impact again, and I polished glasses and counted exits and watched people pretend to be moved. Claire came with her board chair, not as a date, not as a penitent, but as a person who could hold a microphone without asking it to love her back. She thanked donors, all of them. And then she thanked the volunteers the way real gratitude sounds when it knows the shape of effort. She didn't say Victor's name. She didn't say mine. She didn't need either for the sentence to be complete. After the guests left, after the floor was swept and the last tray nested into silence, I stood at the host stand and looked at the empty room. Claire came up beside me with a half smile that smelled like lemon water. Do you remember our first date? She asked. I did. We had split fries and argued gently about what qualifies as a good song for closing time. She'd picked Nina Simone. I'd picked Silence. She laughed when I said that then and told me silence isn't a song. I told her it can be, if the night did you right. Now, she said, I'm learning to like the quiet parts. I nodded and said, me too? Because sometimes the truest thing you can say is that you're still learning. Months take their time, and then suddenly they don't. The project survived without Victor. Smaller, but cleaner. Like soup that simmers long enough to tell the truth about its ingredients. The restaurant survived as restaurants do. On the backs of people you never thank enough. Max finished the school year with a drawing of our family standing under a crooked rainbow that looked like a bridge. He gave it to both of us at a table in a diner that serves pancakes without asking if you want permission to be a child. Claire moved into a small place with a window that loved mornings. I kept our home with the plant Max insists on watering aggressively. We swapped schedules with the ease of people who have decided not to make each other the problem. I didn't tell the story online. I didn't post the envelope or the letter or my restraint. I didn't pitch it to a podcast that turns pain into episodes. I learned to value the way a room can stay inside the people who were there. I do not think silence is a virtue by itself. I think it is a tool like any other, best used by people who know what they're building. We built something that year. A map that shows you how to get back to yourself without changing your address. One afternoon in late summer, I found Max at the kitchen table drawing a new plane. He looked up and asked, "Do I get to give Mom another envelope sometime?" I asked why. He said, because it made her look like she needed a hug. I told him the envelopes were for grown-up things and hugs were for everyone. He said, good, and returned to his lines. I took a picture of his hands because sometimes proof is not for a judge. Sometimes it's for a future you who might forget that you did one gentle thing on time. Claire and I still argue about small things because small things are where real life lives. We argue about whether Max should join the travel soccer team that will turn our weekends into map problems. We argue about the right time to introduce new people to him. We argue about whose turn it is to sit through the school play where every child is a tree. We argue like people who remember that no tree is the villain. We recover quickly because it turns out practice makes possible. You can train a marriage to do anything. You can also train a divorce to be a decent neighbor. On the anniversary of that birthday, I asked Claire if she wanted to have a small dinner with Max. She said yes like a person who wanted less, which is a compliment to a year that had more of the wrong kind. I made pasta that steam remembered. Max put a candle in a cupcake and told Claire to make a wish that wasn't a person. She did. After Max was asleep, we washed dishes the way people who have carried hotter things know how to handle heat. Claire dried a pan and said, I'm sorry I thanked him. I said, me too. She said, not for what you think. I said, for what I think, probably. We placed the pan on the rack and didn't make a speech about forgiveness. Later, in the quiet that wasn't a song but wasn't not a song, I thought about the envelopes. The first had been a line drawn in daylight. The second had been a doorway that refused to be dramatic. The third had been the kind of letter that rooms remember even after people leave. If you asked me now what I believe about revenge, I would tell you this. It's not the heat you throw at someone who bruised your pride. It's the warmth you keep for the people you promised not to let down. It's planning a future that doesn't use a child as a witness. It's letting the facts do their slow work until even rumor is bored. I still see Victor sometimes, usually in the edges of rooms that enjoy their mirrors. He nods because men nod when they don't have anyone to introduce you to. I nod back because dignity is easier than drama. I still see Claire always, because she is Max's mother and my history and my co-conspirator in keeping a schedule that protects a boy from the news, but teaches him to listen to the weather. We still build calendars and bake pancakes and go to games where the score matters less than the snack rotation. We tell the truth when we can, and when we can't, we wait until we can. If you're reading this for instructions, I'm sorry. I don't have any. I have a white envelope, a child whose hands were steady, and a night where I chose to be boring in public because boring is what saved us. I have a restaurant that taught me to send things at the right temperature and a home that taught me to accept when something is done. I have a photo of Max's airplane and a folder marked closed loops and a calendar that holds fewer names than last year and more space than I knew how to want. Sometimes I walk into the dining room between seatings and imagine all the toasts that could be given and all the ones that shouldn't be. I straighten a knife by a plate because angle is a language too. I think about the man I was the night Claire said Victor's name into a glass, and I think about the man I became in the weeks that followed. They are both me. One was good at pretending he didn't hear small sounds. One learned how to write them down until the song made sense. On my way back to the kitchen, I pass the pastry station where a cook is piping chocolate letters onto a plate. I wonder what they'll say. I hope they say happy something real. The night ends and begins again the way nights do in restaurants. I lock the front door, count the drawer, sign the log, and stand for 1 second in the quiet that makes the whole thing possible. Out on the street, someone laughs too loud. A bus hisses. A couple argues about a thing that isn't the thing. I walk home under the same old lights that make everything look like a decision. When I reach our building, I take the stairs instead of the elevator because I like the way a step feels like a promise kept. I open the door to my place, and the plant is still alive, and the dishes are still drying, and the calendar still tells the truth as best it can. I don't know if Claire and I will ever be one house again. I don't know if Victor will ever learn how to be grateful for the kind of life that doesn't applaud him. I don't know if Max will remember the envelope as anything other than a paper he handed his mother on a night full of cake. I do know this. When the time came to choose the temperature of my response, I picked warm, not hot. I kept the room safe for the only witness who mattered. And when the story tried to write me as a man who needed revenge like fuel, I wrote back with a quieter line. Thank you for the lesson. We'll be over here, living. On the day Max turned 9, he wanted a scavenger hunt. We hid notes around the apartment that sent him looking for small good things. A baseball cap, a comic book, a flashlight that turned our hallway into a tunnel. The last clue sent him to the fridge, where a single white envelope waited. He opened it with both hands. Inside was a note in my handwriting that said, "For emergencies only." Under it was a list. Take 3 deep breaths, drink a water, ask for help, tell the truth. He grinned and said, "Is this the real gift?" I said, "It always was." He put the paper in his pocket like a tool and ran to find the flashlight again. There are nights when the dining room swells with birthdays and clapping, and I think about how gratitude can be a trick, how thanks can be a currency, how a name can be a spell. I've come to believe that the only antidote is specificity. Thank your mother for picking you up early on the day you didn't want to be at school. Thank the server for catching the glass before it broke. Thank your son for trusting his hands. Thank your ex-wife for learning to open a letter without burning the house down. Thank the air for being quiet long enough to let you hear what you already knew. I go to the market on a Saturday and buy bread I will never pronounce, and oranges that promise juice like sunlight. I stand in line behind people imagining dinners better than they can make, and I feel kind toward them because I am one of them. On my way home, I stop at the small park where Max likes to point at airplanes, leaving blue threads in the sky. He asks where they're going. I tell him somewhere that needs what they carry. He asks what we carry. I say envelopes and schedules and jokes. He says, and pancakes. And I say, obviously. Because we are not saints. We are a family that didn't end. We're a shape that learned another way to fit. If there's a lesson, it isn't clever. It's this. When someone thanks the wrong person in a room you care about, you don't have to destroy the room. You can open a window. You can let the air in. You can hand a white envelope to a person you promised to honor. And then you can accept the answer the room gives back. If the answer is smaller than you hoped, build a bigger morning. If the answer is bigger than your pride, set the table. Light the lamp the same time every evening. Keep the calendar honest. Say the names that deserve to be said. And if you must thank someone, start with the kid who trusted you enough to carry the gift. In early autumn, when the city started wearing sweaters it didn't need, I took a day off and drove nowhere in particular. The highway became a conversation with myself. I thought about the jobs I've had that taught me how to stand without being seen. Busboy, runner, line cook, the man who tells other men to check the corners before they send something too hot to touch. There's an honor in daily work that movies can't photograph. It lives in clean aprons and quiet fixes. It lives in knowing when to replace a pan before it complains. It lives in keeping the guests happy without teaching them how complex that happiness is. Maybe relationships are like that too. Maybe love is a kitchen where half the prep happens before the room opens. I stopped at a gas station where the clerk had the radio tuned to a station that believed in old guitar lines. A guy at the next pump argued with his girlfriend on speakerphone while pretending not to. 2 teenagers shared a bag of chips like a negotiation. A man in a suit cleaned his windshield with the careful anger of someone who had decided to hate the day. I looked at all of them and felt a wave of gentleness that felt like warmth, not pity. We're all carrying something that doesn't belong on a shelf. If you keep it steady long enough, it becomes the kind of weight that builds you instead of breaking you. When I got home, Claire was on the couch reading a book with a cover that promised less than it delivered. She said Max was at a friend's, which meant the apartment was quiet in the way a stage is quiet after the curtain falls. We talked about the furnace and whether the building would ever fix the rattle. We talked about the budget the board had finally approved. We talked about a woman at her office who was brave in a new way. Then we didn't talk. We watched a half hour of a nature documentary where whales moved like continents learning ballet. I thought about calm and about how it isn't the absence of weather. It's learning which storms belong to you. I don't know when I started writing lists that were not to-do lists. Maybe it was the envelopes. Now I keep a list on my phone called Things I Will Thank Later, and I add to it when the world isn't watching. Today it says, Max's shoelaces surviving recess. The line cook who fixed the broken timer with tape when it mattered. Claire's email where she used the word boundary correctly and didn't make it a threat. My mother's message that said simply, love you, don't forget to sleep. The sun leaving the sky politely instead of crashing out of it. Lists are a way to tally grace without turning it into an invoice. If you want to know whether we reconciled, I don't have an answer that fits inside one sentence. We reconciled with the idea that we owed the truth more than we owed a picture. We reconciled with a schedule and a shared folder and a ritual where Max gets to decide whether we eat spaghetti or tacos every Thursday. We reconciled with the fact that we had been unfair to each other in small ways that became big. We reconciled enough to sit at the same bleachers and yell for the same kid. We did not reconcile with the myth that a story is only good if it returns to the first paragraph. Good stories know when to turn the page. On a night when the restaurant was closed for deep cleaning, I walked through the dining room with the lights bright enough to make everything confess. Without the usual dim, the scratches on the tables showed up like stories. I traced one with my finger and remembered a birthday party that had run too long and a knife someone had used as a pen. I smelled bleach and lemon and the hum of refrigeration, the heart of a place that works. I thought about forgiveness then. Not the kind that erases, but the kind that lets you see the scratch and keep the table, because the table has earned its place. I think that's the kind I want to practice. Later that week, Max brought home a permission slip and asked me what permission was. I told him it's what you ask for when there's a rule and a reason to bend it. He asked if adults have permission slips. I said sometimes we write our own and pretend someone else signed them. He laughed like he had caught me. He asked if the envelopes were permission slips. I told him they were instructions for being brave. He said that sounded harder. I told him it was. At the diner, an old couple folded their hands together across a Formica table like they'd accidentally become one person. The waitress refilled their coffee without asking. I watched them the way you watch stars that don't know they're famous. I wondered if they ever had an envelope moment. I wondered if forgiveness for them was a breakfast you show up to every day, even when you forgot what you were mad about. I paid my check and tipped heavy, because the cook had drawn a smiley face and ketchup on Max's plate without being asked. And grace deserves interest. In winter, the restaurant added a stew that chased away arguments. In spring, we put strawberries on a salad and pretended to be surprised when people smiled. In summer, we served cold soups that made heat a friend. At home, the seasons changed with less theater but more substance. The whiteboard got dingy, and then we bought another. Claire learned to sleep without her phone auditioning for attention. I learned to answer emails with the word no where it belonged. Max learned he could tie his laces without supervision and then immediately asked for Velcro because freedom is negotiable. One evening, I saw Victor again across a room that smelled like money and mints. He was laughing too loudly. He was wearing a new watch. He was with a man I recognized from pictures with captions like honoree and visionary. I felt nothing that could serve as fuel. I felt the mild curiosity you give to a car you used to want and now pass without turning your head. I checked the exits out of habit, not fear. I walked back to my side of the room and told a host to seat a table where the light would flatter them, because sometimes kindness is knowing how to place a person in a room. At bedtime, Max asked me if I remembered the birthday with the envelopes. I asked him what he remembered. He said cake and a funny hat and that Mom looked like she was holding her breath. I asked if it made him scared. He said no, because I looked like a bridge. I laughed and said I didn't feel like a bridge. He said, that's why it worked, and fell asleep with the ease of people who believe their houses will still be there in the morning. I sat a long time watching him sleep and let gratitude be a verb. If I could talk to my past self, the one staring at a glass, catching Claire's reflection while she said another man's name, I would tell him to take a breath. I would tell him to trust the plan and the envelope and the child who would carry it. I would tell him to sit at the table and leave the door unlocked for the right kind of honesty. I would tell him he would not become a man he couldn't respect. I would tell him that revenge is a word for people who haven't learned the satisfaction of documentation. And love is a word for people who keep a room safe while the truth finds its voice. When I finish this story, not with a flourish, but with a light turned off at the right time, I think about how small everything is that tries to be big. A birthday, a thank you with the wrong name in it, a white envelope, a boy's 2 hands, a letter that moved money into a safer future, a plan that chose warm over hot, a kitchen that taught me patience and temperature, a woman who learned the difference between gratitude and debt, a man who learned that the best thing you can be in a crisis is boring and kind. Maybe that's all we ever needed to be.